Okay, so for anyone who just arrived, go to this link and then when you're asked for a code, type in EPWZ, I think, right? I believe.
EPWZ.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about perhaps how we can leverage curiosity. I'm John Kane.
I'm Rebecca Mushtare.
And this was actually a talk we put together for a keynote at a conference a month or so ago, roughly. I don't know, sometime in the distant past. And
So when we think about curiosity, I think a lot about my own daughter, who is 9 now, but a particular story I wanted to share is when she was about 3 and headed to pre-K. And in the car, we're driving to pre-K. It's maybe a 5-minute drive. We start having these really deep conversations with the question, quite literally, she asked, "What is real?" She's 3 and we're going to pre-K. But this just really demonstrates like the depth of curiosity that kids have all the time, right? From the when they're really little. And then at some point it kind of fizzles, right? But they're curious about all aspects of their world.
and this observing the same thing, Josh Eiler was motivated to write a book called How Humans Learn because he observed just how curious his daughter was. And then he was comparing that to how curious his students were. And he noted that somehow this gets lost along the way. So one of the things we're going to talk about is ways perhaps we can increase curiosity.
We have a Josh
And
Eiler quote,
and we have a Josh Eiler quote,
maybe.
maybe.
Let me just use the arrow.
Yeah, I know, but I was using the presenter mode, so it was supposed to be changing it.
This is yours.
Oh, okay. So, and here is that quote from Josh Eiler, that curiosity is an essential part of the way humans learn, and it always has been. In order to learn something, we must first wonder about it. That in general, our brains have been trained to keep track of those things that are important to us, and wondering about it is part of that whole aspect.
So, given that we don't have a large crowd today, I think we can just kind of allow people to unmute and share. But um, we want you to think about and identify a moment in school that was memorable for you. So, take a minute and just think about like what is memorable school, and then think about whether or not was that like a positive or negative memory, and why was it memorable. So take a second to think about that, and then if anyone's willing to share, we invite you to unmute and share your example.
Do you have a preference for like we were talking like college is probably
Anywhere.
Any
anyway.
school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have this memory when I was in undergrad, I was a music major and I was in this Indonesian gamelan ensemble. So it's this huge like orchestra of like, percussion instruments and gongs and things like that. And we went to a high school to perform for the day, which was kind of ridiculous that we moved this whole thing. We put this whole thing onto a tour bus and like drove to Long Island. And in retrospect, I think I have to think about like the wealth of that high school. It's like a private school in Long Island that they could afford to pay for this. And then on the way back, so I was a freshman in college, I think. On the way back, we stopped probably somewhere in Queens and went like they took the entire class like I don't know 20, 30 people out to this Indonesian restaurant and just had this like giant meal for all these people. Um, and I think it's stuck with me because first it was like a very kind of fun, unusual experience, and also just like thinking back on just like the logistics of that. Like as a freshman, I was somewhat oblivious to just like well, these things are just kind of unfolding, and I wasn't really aware of like where we were going or what are the things that we were doing. And so in some ways, it sort of just felt like this magical, bizarre experience.
I feel like a lot of times those like most memorable moments are like have strong emotional connections to, and they're either really positive or really negative, and all the ones that are just kind of meh are the ones you don't remember.
Mhm.
And most of those are the standard types of classroom interactions that
Yeah.
we have. It's those special events, those unusual things that often stand out in our memory.
I also feel like the things that I remember the most from college had nothing to do with my major, right? The classes that I remember the most and think about now, it's like, an astronomy class and a history of the English language class, right? These things are sort of outside my main field of study, made the most impression.
I think like I know when John and I were putting this presentation together originally, like some of the things that I remember the most from being a kid in school are things like um an eighth grade math class where the teacher, it was like an advanced math class, and the teacher said to the girls in the class that the boys were going to beat them on the test because like we couldn't possibly do as well. But don't worry, we did way better because that was very motivating. But in a really negative way.
And it doesn't always or even typically work that way.
No, but it was just like such a terrible moment that it stands out and sticks with me for many years later.
Actually, one of my negative experiences from college was getting a paperback that I had written and got an extremely low grade. It was in this gen ed type course, and I had been taking honors writing classes and English classes, and I got a C minus on this. So after the class, and there were no comments or notes on it. So I asked the instructor after class why my grade was so low. What was he deducting points for? And he said, well, he thought that this paper was too good to have been written by an undergraduate, so clearly I must have plagiarized. So I got kind of angry, yelled at him a little bit, and put the paper down on the desk and said, if you think this is plagiarized, find a source where it was plagiarized from. All the sources I used are listed in the bibliography and cited as appropriate. And then the next class, he did give it back to me with a grade of C. And he said, well, I looked at it again and it wasn't really that good after all. So that was one of those negative sorts of emotions. Positive ones often involve being in the college jazz band, for example, and some of the tours we did, or working in a political science club and so forth, and experiences that were often outside of the classroom. But those emotional connections can be important. Anyone else want to share? Okay, we can move on. And now we're going to do a little poll. And this poll is a multiple choice one. And so there we go. Oops. Yeah, this one apparently wasn't set up to automatically detect the screen. So this will be on that iClicker response.
Yeah, and the question is, what proportion of your students are curious about your discipline? A, 0 to 19%, B, 20 to 39%, C, 40 to 59%, D, 60 to 79%, or E, 80 to 100%. I think there's only two people saying this.
Okay, so we can stop the poll then. And let's see how it looks. Okay, 0 to 19%, 20 to 39%. And in one of the truly amusing quotes from Woodrow Wilson, when he was the prince, what was he? He was the president at Princeton. Someone asked him how many students they had at Princeton, and his response was about 10%. Um, and so this sort of feeling is not unique, but we often are disappointed that our students aren't as interested in the discipline as we are. But again, we were also selected because we continued doing this because we found it interesting and engaging, but our students don't always.
We talked a little bit about, young kids being really curious, but students are curious about other things too, right? They might have a hobby that they spend a lot of time on. Maybe they're a musician. Maybe there's a particular form of art that they are really engaged with. Maybe they're like an expert video game player. Some of the things up here are things that my daughter is really interested in, like animals, or sports. or hiking, but we all have things that we're curious about. They just aren't always academic interests, right? They might be outside of that space, and there's a reason for that, right? Like some of those other spaces are set up to be more engaging than a classroom space. So the one that I want us to talk about or focus on today is games and why games are desirable and how we can leverage some of the qualities of games in other contexts. It doesn't mean that we need to use gamification, but we can leverage some of the same kinds of qualities to get similar results. So one of the things that's really desirable about a game is that it has rules and goals that are completely transparent, right? The you know what the mission is. You know what you need to achieve to move to the next level. The rules are explicit, and if it's a video game, like you can't actually break the rules, right? Like they're coded into the system. And so that transparency can be really helpful because there's not so much of a mystery about what you're supposed to be doing. Games also have feedback systems built in and kind of this like right amount of challenge. So they're really excellent at enjoyable failure, right? So, your character dies and you get like rewarded with like a funny animation or something, and you can kind of re-engage. So those opportunities to kind of see where you're at, get kind of this automatic feedback, right? Like maybe there's you have this many lives or this much energy, right? And there's these kind of systems that allow you to get this information all the time. And then you get rewards that are meaningful to the game, right? So, you get a level up or you get, a new life or whatever, more resources or whatever that particular game is about. The other thing that's really interesting about games is that it's voluntary, right? Like you are intentionally engaging in obstacles, right? And you have a lot of agency in that um, because you volunteered to be there, right? And a lot of times, if you think about like a required class or something, that students may not feel a sense of agency because this is, kind of dictated as to what you might do. So you want to think about ways inside of that class where you can have that feeling of voluntary participation or sense of agency or choice. Games also have really satisfying work. There's a lot of like things that need to do, and sometimes it's really like a grind, right? But then at the end that you feel like you've achieved something, and it's meaningful to this like leveling up or going to the next level in the game. And then finally, games are really great at social connectivity. There's the community of gamers or the people that you might be playing the game with, those that love kind of the world of the game, or maybe like the kind of community that surrounds a game. It might not be the people like, it might not be the game itself, but it might be this whole culture that surrounds the game. But one of the key things about this is feeling a sense of you're a part of something that's bigger than yourself. And that's something that we can foster in a classroom too. This like this feeling of being a part of something big. Now for the downer.
But this is not the type of connection that most students feel to school. This is actually taken from Rebecca Winthrop and her co-authors, whose names I don't remember, The Disengagement Gap, a paper put out by Brookings. And what happens is it looks at surveys of students from, in this case, grades 3 through 12, and the dash line, the bottom one, is the proportion of students who agreed that with the statement they love school. And the solid line, the one on the top, tells us the proportion of students who agreed with the statement that I learn a lot. And we notice a pretty strong pattern there, pretty much beginning in third grade. It's pretty high for both of those in K through 3, but beginning after third grade, we see some pretty large drop-offs, both in the proportion of students who feel that they're learning and also people who enjoy being in school. And those are the students on the right tail that are entering college. And so they've pretty much been conditioned to, or their experiences have led them to not really enjoy being in school and feeling disconnected. And in some other work that Rebecca Winthrop has done, there's a book that she wrote, and I think we have that in some of the links we're going to share later. They talk about some of the reasons for this, but in general, students have increasingly felt that what they're doing in school, in college, and up until college is not really connected with the rest of their lives. They don't see the meaning in it. They don't see the purpose in it.
think we have a
So
whole list
they
of those on the next slide.
there's a whole list of those perhaps on the next slide. Okay. Yes, and in fact, here are some of these issues that students do not feel, they don't see why it's important, that we're not always transparent about explaining why the things we're doing in class may be valuable for them. So that's one of the issues. We may think it's important, but we're not conveying that. They don't see the relevance or the agency in what they're doing, or they have little agency as being dictated to them. They often feel judged or talked down to, and this shows up in many surveys, that basically there's an authority who's determining all of this, and they don't have the same sort of say they do when they're participating in games. They don't feel, sometimes they don't feel challenged, or at the other extreme, they don't feel competent. So, and we'd like them to be challenged, but also to develop that sense of competence. Students have also learn to develop a fear of failure or mistakes because they've been told that the grade is what matters to them. That if they do poorly, if they don't do well on any given assessment, it's a sign of failure. And in fact, we call it failing when they don't do very well. And the curricula tends to get narrower and narrower as they move through the educational process, where they don't see the same sort of broader social connections or the how these things relate to the world in which they're living. We also don't do a lot to cultivate their attention. And we don't see a lot of social accountability taking place within this. It's mostly students working alone without working with their peers. And one of the things that's happened is we have so many other external distractions, particularly with mobile computing. And there have been a lot of studies that have shown that this does lead to more distraction because apps on laptops and on mobile devices, on phones, are designed to capture attention. That's that's part of the bad news. The other part is in studies where they've shut down the use of mobile devices in schools, there's been no long-term increase in student performance. So getting rid of phones doesn't seem to work either, although many school systems have moved to prohibiting phones during the school day.
I want to shift gears a little bit and think about maybe a teaching strategy that you've considered using but haven't implemented. And specifically, what's preventing you from implementing and taking action? So a lot of times maybe you go to a lot of professional development workshops, you get excited about something, but then maybe you haven't actually taken the steps to fully implement it into your class.
So we'll put this up as well. You could either just say it or we could do it as a poll. What are some of the barriers? We can start the poll and see how that goes. Or you can just say something too.
I've been thinking, I just thought about this. I thought about this for a while and I was thinking about it again yesterday, the idea of mandatory doodling in class. Because I like getting students to take notes is really hard. And I feel like I'm kind of end up answering questions again and again. And I had heard something, actually it might have been at one of these like SELT seminars like last year or something like that, that doodling is like cognitively beneficial. And so I was thinking about trying that out where like what if it wasn't that you had to take notes, is that you had to doodle during lectures and presentations and not on your phone or some device, it had to be in a notebook. Um, and I don't know what's preventing me from taking action. I'm not sure. Maybe it seems silly.
I think those are, I mean, I think that's often like not really sure how it's gonna go or like being unsure about how it might be taken is something that often prevents us from trying something.
Yeah.
Students who have ADHD in particular can benefit from doodling because it's a way of keeping their of assisting them in maintaining focus. And that I know there has been some
Yep,
studies
yep,
on.
definitely.
I was thinking about that yesterday because I was in a meeting which I really didn't want to be at. And And I had my laptop with me, and so I was working on some. I was basically doing some kind of drawing on my computer, and I was fully engaged with the meeting. And I realized, well, I'm keeping my hands busy, and so that allows me to pay attention to the things that are being said. And so I like, well, if that works for me, why wouldn't I try to institute this for my students?
Mhm. So little things like that. But anyone else have any suggestions of why we might want to implement something, but we don't? Why don't we try these things? Well, we can tell you a few things that came up when we were doing the keynote.
Well, and we can
Oh,
also, the next slide also has
oh,
examples.
okay. So we can go to the next slide and see. We can try to go to the next slide and see. Okay. So, well, actually, before that, though, one thing I did want to mention is the most common responses we got was time,
Time.
because we didn't include that in there, but it was something that came up most often, I believe, when we asked this. So, a couple of the things that serve as a barrier. One is status quo bias. It's a behavioral bias that cognitive scientists, that behavioral economists, behavioral psychologists, and so forth have looked at quite a bit. And in general, if given a choice between doing things the same way and doing something differently, people most often choose to keep doing the same way. It's a way of conserving our mental energy, and it's just simpler to do things in ways that we're used to. So we do tend to get in ruts. It's in fact, that's what allows us to get through all the decisions we have to make in a day. But that doesn't always work in a positive way. It can mean that we may do things that may not always be optimal because it's just easier to keep doing things the same way. Part of the reason for that is something known as risk aversion, which is another really robust finding in behavioral economics. And that if given a choice between gaining a dollar or losing a dollar, the benefits of gaining a dollar turn out to be roughly half the estimated value of the loss of a dollar. In general, we weight losses much more heavily than we weight benefits. So, given that risk aversion, it's always safer to keep doing things the same way.
That leads really nicely into the idea of perfectionism as well, which is really this idea that like I don't want to do it if my standard is going to be short of flawless, right? That can also tie to things like I'm afraid it might fail. What if it goes wrong? You know, and all of those kind of feelings around that can prevent you from even getting started or doing something that might be incremental or iterative. The other thing that often comes up is imposter phenomenon, and that's really the experience of kind of believing that you're not as competent as others might actually perceive you to be, right? Usually in this case, like people are competent and they're perceived as competent, but they themselves don't necessarily believe that same level of competence, or they feel like a phony or a fraud. Um, I think these all tie into this idea of time as well, because when you're allocating time, right, like it's always at the cost of something else. And so if you're gonna, invest some time in making a change in your course, right, like there's some level of like wanting to make sure it pays off, right, in the end. So we wanted to share this quote from Sarah Rose Kavanaugh in The Spark of Learning, which I believe we used as a reading book group, right, a while back. When you draw people's attention to the gap between their current state of knowledge and what they perceive as knowable, both interest and curiosity are generated. And I think there's like quite a bit of a nugget right there, is ways that we can kind of tune our classes to really engage students by helping them leverage the knowledge they do have, but also helping them to see that there's more to know that they might be that they might be able to get excited about or curious about.
And so, one way of doing that is with asking students to make predictions about the results of an experiment or what happens when certain things occur without having had them read about that or study that in advance. And one of the things that Dan Ariely did was, well, before he was having some issues with perhaps some questionable ethical experiments, One thing he did note, which resonated well with me, is that he would give these examples of situations where the outcomes were really unexpected. And then he'd present that to a group of students or a group of executives who were coming in for talks on behavioral economics. And after he did, they just say, well, yeah, that's what I'd expect to happen. So what he started doing is he started polling people and asking them what they thought would happen for this experiment. And the reactions were very different when they had to think about it in advance, because it's always easier to make sense of things after the fact than it is when you're trying to predict it. And also, pre-testing is something that's been shown for a couple decades now to be important in helping people learn. Where in classrooms, we could do pre-testing by asking students to take a test on something they have not yet read about or not yet studied. And that seems to increase student performance quite a bit partly because it provokes curiosity about what's going to happen.
Another strategy for curiosity is kind of building in mystery and storytelling. So narratives can draw people in. Sarah Rose Kavanaugh specifically talks about mysteries in her book, and that, you know, if you're acting like a detective to solve a mystery or to kind of find an answer and to investigate, you feel more invested in what's going on, and you can kind of connect more to the information.
And then debates can also be used to help do the same thing, because when students are engaging in a debate, they have to investigate all sides of an issue. So they have to be curious, not just about what they already believe, but about what the alternative sides are, because they have to be prepared in order to address questions from or responses from the other side.
Ken Bain and Jim Lang have certainly challenged us in different contexts to think about the big questions. So, you know, what are the big questions that your course engages with? Maybe it doesn't try to answer because not maybe they're not answerable, right? But they're big questions that your class or the content of your course maybe gets at or starts to address. And when those are really big, it's kind of that feeling of being a part of something bigger than yourself, right? It's you know, what is these big complicated questions that this information ties into a bit.
And he gives examples of how, or Ken Bain gave examples of how a whole course could be built around that one central question, where students work towards that by the end of the course being able to answer it. And he gave an example of a calculus class that was tied to some very elaborate problem. But he showed students how, by developing all these skills and these techniques, they would ultimately be able to answer that. And he suggests that's a good way of starting a class, or even just in a given class session. Start with a question that's going to provoke curiosity, where it's not clear what the answer is. And that brings us to the wicked problems, which are problems that do not have a clear answer, where people can have very different opinions, but they have to bring in knowledge from many different domains. And it involves much more integration of knowledge and things that can be really helpful in motivating that learning. Things like the environment. How can we solve environmental issues today? How can we deal with these other big societal issues? So now we're going to do a little poll, and it's going to be a multiple answer poll. And select any of these that you have tried: priming with pretest or prediction in a class, developing a mystery, using debates, big questions, or wicked problems. And the last two are kind of related, often. Well, I guess some big questions have answers and others don't.
Also, given the size of the group too, if you just want to chime in a little bit,
Yeah,
feel
that's
free
true.
to. Or are these all new?
I've done a little bit of and I guess I haven't done debate so much as just like discussion about two different possibilities or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, either doing that kind of perspective taking or taking perspective, like exploring different points of view can also develop curiosity, especially if you lean towards one point of view and need to start to understand a different point of view.
Mhm.
And it's nice to see that both respondents chose priming with a pretest or prediction, because I don't think that's done that often in practice.
I think my I've leaned more towards like the developing a mystery or like the wicked problems type stuff in my classes.
Okay. And another vote for big questions. Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. So, an essay. So, some ways of
Okay.
providing students with agency and choice. One way of doing that is with something called an unessay. We talked about that in well, we had a podcast, couple of podcasts on that actually. But an unessay is basically anything other than an essay, where students could demonstrate their knowledge by creating a video, by creating a podcast, by creating a board game. By one example that was given in one of our workshops was um, the associate director here, who's on leave this year, was teaching a course in criminal justice where one of the issues was they were talking about prison food. So one of the students in the class got the recipe for something that was produced in the prisons, and she produced that food and shared it with the class as an example of perhaps the treatment that prisoners were getting in terms of the food that they were receiving. Infographics, there's any number of things you can use, and they tend to be much more engaging and much more interesting for students. And they can also leverage the specific skills and interests of students. Some students might really enjoy creating videos. They might want to do a TikTok video, for example, or they might prefer creating a meme or an infographic to demonstrate some concept.
Another good strategy for agency, to help students have agency in the class is through co-design. And so there's a lot of different aspects of a course that maybe could be co-designed. In other words, maybe you have an initial frame and then students can contribute to it or help make edits or make suggestions. So that could be parts of the syllabus. It could be an assignment. It could be maybe some of the course content, like some of the topics. Maybe there's a suite of choices and the students can help select which ones are going to be covered. Maybe what might be weighted on a rubric, or even defining what success is or what not being successful looks like on a rubric. And any of those things, then the student has some ownership over that element of the class, and then they're more likely to be engaged because they feel that sense of agency.
And in general, we ourselves are more likely to be interested in doing something when it's our decision to do it. And it's not being imposed on us by some administrator, for example, like when we have to do
Right.
those annual reports and things. Flexibility in deadlines can be really helpful. Flexibility in the choice of topics or the way in which the medium of expression, the way in which they express themselves can be helpful.
Another way you can get a sense of agency is through kind of options for participation. So things like, rather than just, participating in a discussion or maybe the traditional ways you might expect a student to participate in class, offers a suite of options. So things like maybe providing note summaries or providing discussion questions or running a back channel, sketch notes, curating resources, moderating a discussion, or maybe doing something like a silent gallery walk with sticky notes.
And another option is having students explicitly set their goals for the semester at the beginning of the term, and then periodically having them check in on their progress towards the goal. That can encourage more metacognition and again, give students more buy-in because you're not imposing goals on them. They specified the goals they want to achieve, and you're just helping them get there. And again, that certainly increases autonomy. So, a poll. Again, which of these have you tried?
So A, an unessay, B, co-design, C, flexibility and deadlines, topics, media, D, options for participation, or E, student goal setting. So these again are strategies for agency or choice. I think we've got our responses there, John.
Well, we have three
Oh,
people.
there's three.
Yep. Okay. So let's see. Goal setting three. That's one I haven't done as much. So there's one I want to do in the future, but in an essay and a co-designing some component of the course. Good.
Yeah, so it looks like there's some areas where people might do some exploration, right, with some flexibility options, or in some ways an NSA is a level of flexibility.
Mm.
Uh, or even thinking about some of those options for participation that might allow people with different preferences to feel more engaged or belong to the class.
So, one way of showing relevance is asking students to justify the relevance. One of our former provosts here, a number of years ago, was teaching a COIL course. And in the course, what happened was um, she invited me to the class because it was the end of the semester, and she wanted me to hear about the students' experiences working with students from Lebanon. And initially, the students were complaining a little bit that the main concerns were that the students on the other side did not work in the way they expected. They were late turning in work. They didn't do their fair share at times. And it was going in a fairly negative direction. And what she did then, right, was quite effective. She asked them to think about, before we discussed it anymore, to think about what skills they were developing that might be helpful for use in the future. And all of a sudden, that whole discussion turned around. They started talking about how they learned how to work with people from other countries and cultures, how they learned how to communicate. This was about 10 or 12 years ago. So they were also learning how to use electronic media and things, not Zoom, but things similar for video chats and communications and Google Docs to share materials and to work on projects across borders. And they were learning about how to deal with issues when people may not always do what you expect them to do in terms of, working in teams and so forth. And that became a much more positive discussion when the students got to reflect on their professional interests and goals and how what you were doing in the class, how that connected to things they may have to learn how to do in the future. So instead of telling students what we're doing will help you develop teamwork and all these other NACE competencies, have students themselves reflect on it. And when it's their idea, they buy into it much more than if we're just telling them that's what's going to happen.
Another way to help students develop this sense of relevance is by providing diverse examples, readings, and voices. And the key is to like have a lot of different kinds of identities represented so that students can see themselves in the field and in the discipline. And that can help students feel like their voice is also relevant and that what you're talking about is relevant.
And if you're in a discipline where there may not be that much diversity, you can ask the students to bring their own reflections to a reading or to a topic of how they've observed it in their family or in their environment and so forth, because then they are making the connections that may sometimes not be there in the established canon. The tilt framework is another useful thing, and I think some of you have heard this multiple times, but the tilt framework is a transparency and learning and teaching approach developed by Marian Winklemas. And basically, what it involves is making clear to students what the purpose of any assignment is, making clear exactly what you're asking them to do, and also how they're going to be evaluated on it. Because we know what we want students to do and we know why, but we don't always convey that. And students who come from backgrounds where they may not have been prepared for these types of assignments that we're doing because the quality of the schools, because very few students are going on for college, they may not have had that much experience with it. And that's part of that hidden curriculum that we know what we want students to do, but we don't always convey that very well. And so the TILT framework is one way of conveying all that information to give them more sense of purpose and relevance in what we're asking them to do.
We have wicked problems up here again because this is again another way to establish relevance. But with that, we also have community-based learning, which is kind of a specific way of maybe addressing wicked problems, where you would work with a community partner in some capacity as like a co-teacher of the class, and usually you're solving some sort of community problem and getting information and data from the community that influences maybe a solution. So there's not a right answer to those kinds of like learning opportunities, and can be really great way to build community in the class, but also to feel connections to a community. And there's different ways to kind of do that. I've done projects before with like the Children's Museum of Oswego. My class designed their website, their initial website, now a number of years ago. So it's evolved from what it was that was initially designed. But we worked with them. We did some research on like who was engaging with the website, what they were information they were looking for, et cetera, to kind of solve that problem, the communication problem that they were struggling with. And so these kinds of things can be really powerful for students.
Now, we indirectly talked about the promising syllabus
Yep.
before that Ken Bain and Jim Lang have both talked about the promising syllabus fairly extensively in their books and in their podcasts and talks. But the basic idea is that you start your syllabus not as a list of rules, but as something that by completing the activities in the course, they're going to be able to achieve this final goal. So you're making a promise to the student that by doing the things we're asking them to do, they'll be able to achieve something that they couldn't do before the start of the term, and motivating everything in that way of providing these skills rather than thou shalt not do this, this, and this.
It's really about tone and how it's framed. Yeah. And then the last one we have for relevance is the idea of kind of guided notes or guided questions, maybe something like skeleton notes, where you help students identify some of the key main ideas and allow them to fill in some gaps. But as you may know from learning something that's outside of your own field, that sometimes it's hard to know what is actually relevant, right? Like there's all these details and things, and you might lock into a detail rather than like the big picture or the main thing that needs to be focused on. So helping beginners or someone who's new to a discipline kind of sort through the noise to know what's the foundational information versus what's more of a detail or supplementary information, what the hierarchy of information is, can be really helpful.
And if you've ever asked students to give a presentation on the paper without having some support, we often will see that. There's often a lot of focus on trivial details while they don't always capture the main concepts. And guided notes and guided questions can help them get there. So we'll do another poll.
So which of the following methods to foster relevance have you tried? A, reflection on interests. B, diverse examples, readings, or voices. C, wicked problems or community-based learning. D, the tilt framework, or E, the promising syllabus.
And pick as many of these as apply.
And obviously not everything we talked about is on this poll.
Yeah. We only have 5 choices
Yeah.
in my clicker. Well, we can take a look and while still seeing what's coming in. Promising syllabus. Oops. Oh, that was, I guess, from before. So reflections on interest, diverse examples, reading and voices. Okay, good.
If I were
Okay.
to pick one of the 3 to maybe give a try, like that tilt framework can be really helpful for students, especially the kind of the demographic of our student body.
So the next thing is giving students a sense of relationships and belonging, that students learn more effectively when they feel they belong in the class. And one simple way of getting started with this is doing a Who's in Class form. Tracy Addy actually has an online form, and we have a link to that in the notes that we're going to share at the end of this. But it could be any type of survey. It could be having students participate in a discussion forum. It could be that they submit some sort of a Google form, or it could be any number of things, but find out more about the students in the class rather than the hypothetical student that you might remember being when you were yourself a student. Because when we first start teaching, we tend to teach to students who in ways that work for us. But our students are not us. We were not typical students when we were students, or we wouldn't be here in this role. So finding out more about the actual students, their interests, their hobbies, and other factors about them can be helpful in using examples in class and getting to know the actual students you're working with.
This next one, memorizing and use names, can feel really daunting, especially if you have a really big class. But Michelle Miller has a whole book on how to remember names and also validates that remembering names is hard. And so she's got a lot of great tips for ways to do that, from flashcards to name cards and many other things as well.
And AI is quickly gaining those capabilities. In fact, just a week or so ago, the beta version of the Meta glasses had image identification, but they hadn't revealed that, which raised some questions. So they pulled that right now. But in general, the memorizing and using names is really important. And that book that Michelle Miller wrote is actually a very short book, the shortest book she's ever written. And she also has a podcast with us and some others where she talks about this. And those strategies are really good.
Yeah, the book is called A Teacher's Guide to Learning Students' Names, Why You Should, Why It's Hard, and How You Can. And she uses what's called the ASAR framework: attend, say, associate, retrieve. And so I don't know, it's really helpful. You should read it.
And I try. Another thing is structured peer-to-peer interactions with roles. Having students work with each other in diverse groups can be really helpful in getting them to know each other. And if you're using group activities, make sure that every student has a role in the group. Those roles might alternate or might vary over the different activities or across different applications, but make sure no one can just sit there quietly and listen to other students. Give students some ways of connecting with each other.
And there's a lot of different kinds of those structured peer-to-peer strategies that like have designated roles. So you can think about team-based learning, collaborative learning, two-stage exams, think, pair, share, etc., where there's already kind of some defined roles that you could latch on to.
And then using open-ended questions can help where there is no right answer, where you can find out more through leaving an open-ended question rather than A, B, C, D, or E or something similar.
Invites more people to provide perspectives because there's not kind of a level of judgment associated with those kinds of questions.
Recognize student diversity and remind students that diversity provides higher quality decision making and better and more informed decision making, and try to leverage the strengths of students. Some students are going to be stronger in some activities than others, or in some ways of presenting information, and that can be something we could try to leverage within groups or in class activities.
Proactive outreach can be really powerful as well. Just something that feels personalized. It doesn't have to be, it can be personalized without being like separate individual things, right? So you can do some personalized outreach using some of the tools in Brightspace, for example, where it would use their name and some other things. So it feels like a personalized interaction, but can also maybe save some time too. So there's ways that, doing proactive outreach doesn't always have to be significantly more work. It might be a little bit of setup at the beginning, but then you can reuse it over and over again.
Providing opportunities for informal interaction, for us to informally interact with students and for them to informally interact with each other. At the start and the end of the class, don't rush in and rush out. I know we have to go through a lot of authentication and other things to get started, but try to get there early and talk to students a bit informally before the class. And I teach a large class of typically 250 to 400 students every fall. And one of the things when I come into that class the first day, there's a lot of students just sitting there staring at their phones. And so one of the first things I do when we get underway is I say, introduce yourself to the students around you. One of the things you'll find is that students will tend to sit in the same seat every class day. So those are the students you're going to be working with in small group interactions throughout the semester. So get to know them now, talk about what year you are, what your major is, what your interests are, what you're planning to do after you graduate and so forth. And that causes students to get to know each other a little bit more than they generally would, because it's really easy to feel anonymous, especially in those large classes. But if they get to know at least the people who are seated around them, that can break down some of that a bit.
We already talked about the tilt framework, but in the context of relationship and belonging, spelling things out and being transparent about what is required or what's expected, or how someone's going to be evaluated or what the goals are is going to help people feel a stronger sense of belonging because they're not feeling lost the whole time, right? And that goes back to that hidden curriculum idea.
So people aren't surprised that
Yeah.
they're the only ones who didn't know how to do something. And humanizing the instructor can be really important. Let students know a little bit about yourself, whatever is appropriate to share with students. If you're teaching an online class, some short video clips might be helpful. But also it can be really helpful if you share, when appropriate, some information about when you struggled with concepts in class. Because if they see that you've reached a stage, but you still had some struggles when you were a student, it makes it much easier for them to see themselves in that type of thing.
So here's a few different methods to foster relationships and belonging to see if you've engaged with. So this is a multi-select again. So A, who's in class form, B, memorizing and using names, C, structured peer-to-peer interaction in any of the forms that we were discussing, D, proactive outreach, or E, informal interactions. And obviously this isn't a comprehensive list either, but.
Let's take a look at what's there, all leave it running. Okay, so
Had a little experimentation in this category, maybe a little more
yeah,
experimentation than some of the other categories.
nice.
It looks like the proactive outreach might be something to think about. There are some things built into Brightspace, right, that will allow you to, if you notice like assignments missing or poor grades, that can kind of initiate some communication, right?
Especially in larger classes where it may be hard to do that regularly, you can set up Brightspace agents that if scores on a particular thing either are missing or are below a certain threshold, just sending out a reminder and checking in with students to see how they're doing. And students tend to respond to those things, even if they're automated.
Especially if you can kind of put in the person's name, et cetera, as part of that communication.
Another thing that's really helpful is working to build a growth mindset. Carol Dweck came up with that concept, but there's been so many studies done, many by Elizabeth Canning and her research team, that have looked at the effect of maintaining, building, and developing a growth mindset in students. And in general, a growth mindset is one where students believe that by doing things and practicing things, they can get better at it, as opposed to a fixed mindset where you believe that you're either good at something or you're bad at it. Now, we all have growth mindsets in some areas. We all have fixed mindsets in other areas. One of the things I hear a lot from students is, I'm not a math person. I just don't understand math. People may say the same thing about not being a creative person, or I'm not an art person, or I'm just not very good at those things. We want to discourage people from doing that in our class. We can't break that down for everybody. We all have some of those feelings ourselves, but certainly we can encourage students to develop a mindset that by working at things, they can get better. And there's a lot of ways we can do that, but just conveying that message is important. And one of the studies that Elizabeth Canning did was in STEM fields, and I forgot what schools it was, but they looked at it involved classes where there were multiple sections, and they surveyed instructors and students using a growth mindset inventory. And what they found were that in general, students with a growth mindset tended to do better, and they tended to have smaller equity gaps and all those other things. But the really interesting thing in that particular study was that faculty mindset mattered about as much as student mindset did. And if faculty had a fixed mindset, on average, students did less well, and all those equity gaps tied to race, to first gen status, Pell eligibility were much larger when the instructors believed as indicated by the responses to the mindset inventory, that students were either good at something or bad at something. And Rebecca's earlier story about males versus females in class is certainly an extreme and very negative example of that sort of fixed mindset. And the instructors were not explicitly stating those things in class, but one hopes at least, because I think these were R1 universities, but the messages still came through in terms of the messages they conveyed when they talked to students. So mindset can be really important.
So we have this quote from Carol Dweck from her book, Mindset, The New Psychology of Success. Mindset change is not about picking up a few pointers here and there. It's about seeing things in a new way. When people change to a growth mindset, they change from a judge and be judged framework to a learn and help learn framework. And I really liked how she phrased it in this particular quote to help us kind of think through what that means. And we're using this to set up our last kind of category of challenge.
And one way of addressing this when a student says, I'm not very good at that, just say, well, maybe not yet.
Yeah. So challenge is something that we want to think about. You can't have something that's too much challenge, right? It's got to be just the right challenge. And that can be challenging to figure out initially, but there's certainly some strategies to think about that. Elizabeth and Robert Bjork kind of call this desirable difficulties. And this is really kind of thinking through tasks that aren't trivial, right? That they do have challenge, but they can't be overwhelming either. So one of the strategies you can think about in terms of challenge is gamification and kind of using some game-like qualities to level up or get rewards or fun failure, right? Those are all things that can kind of fit into this concept of gamification.
Another thing we can do is scaffolding assignments, because one of the things that will affect challenge is how much feedback we give students along the way. And if we break up more complex tasks into small components and give students feedback, we can catch them before they go off in a non-productive direction early. So if, for example, you have a large paper due in a class, maybe ask students to first submit a thesis statement or at least a general discussion of what the paper is about. Then maybe have them submit a bibliography, then maybe an annotated bibliography, then maybe an outline, and then maybe a rough draft and so forth. Because what often happens if we don't provide that sort of scaffolding and we just say we have a 20-page paper that's due in 3 months, students will generally procrastinate, but also the students who've had practice writing 20-page papers will generally do a reasonably decent 20-page paper. But the students who've never been asked to do that might very well turn in something that's not very productive, that doesn't have appropriate references or citations, and so forth. And by scaffolding it, you take a relatively complex task and break it up into more manageable components, more manageable challenges. And so if students have to backtrack and do something a bit differently, they don't have to start from scratch all over again at any stage, which again helps to level the playing field a bit.
I mean, part of our goal is to help students build that efficacy and competence. And so that does mean that they need to be able to fail safely. So having these regular touch points for feedback and then the opportunities for revision so that a mistake isn't devastating, but can be learned from and we can grow from is a really different way of kind of framing a course and framing challenge that can make a really big difference. So giving that regular feedback, but then kind of enforcing the need to act on that feedback is really helpful.
And the next thing is giving students practice before you give any larger assessments. Before they're doing a summative assessment, that's going to have a significant effect on their grades. If you're using a typical grading scheme, make sure they've had lots of opportunities to practice with low stakes assessment. Some people will try no stakes assessment, but what the evidence generally suggests is if the assessments are no stakes, students who most need them will tend not to do them in practice. So we want to put some weight on them, but give students the opportunity to do them over and over again. Mastery learning type quizzes, adaptive learning platforms can do that really nicely, where students can work through it until they master the material. And just having a tiny amount of weight on these things has a really remarkable effect on the incentive for students to complete them.
And our last poll is which of the
Oh,
following.
wait. I
Oh yeah,
forgot to stop the
sorry.
last one. Okay, here we go.
Poll is which of the following methods to foster just the right amount of challenge have you tried? A, gamification, B, scaffolding, C, feedback and revision, D, low stakes formative assessments.
I think we've lost one of the responders, but okay. So let's take a look. Um, okay. Um, Feedback and revision, most common. Gamification is less common. But even if we don't go to a fully gamified route, building in some of those incentives and things, some of the characteristics of games would be nice because students will play games for hours and hours and hours. And if we could just build that same sort of intrinsic motivation into whatever we're doing, it can be helpful.
Some courses are like lend themselves to gamification more than others. But in some cases, you could do something like gaining experience points, but offering a lot of different ways to gain those experience points to kind of move on to another topic or another set of skills. And I've done that in my classes before and has worked successfully. Um, but there's other things too, like anonymous leaderboards and other things that can be motivating and fun, or things that are contained within a single class period rather than something that spans an entire class. They can give a taste of that gamification to provide maybe a little more motivation.
Even throwing in a Kahoot or something like
Yeah.
that can be helpful in having students develop a little more automaticity with some basic concepts. And typically students aren't graded on it, but they enjoy it. And the quicker they respond, the higher their score on the leaderboard. But it's all anonymous except for the student at the end who yells out who they were, who got the high score or something. Um, okay. So
One of the key things to that we would certainly encourage everyone to think about is just modeling your own curiosity, because that in and of itself is contagious and will kind of encourage your students. Usually we're teaching in fields because we're curious about them. And so if you can demonstrate your own interest in finding answers to things and exploring things that you don't know about a field, the more exciting it is for students to kind of go along with you to do that.
it's one of the things Sarah Rose Kavanaugh talked about a lot in each of her books, that importance of being enthused and engaged and so forth. Because if you're bored in class, the students are going to pick up on that and you get in a really poor downward spiral. But if you're excited about the class, that can convey more excitement to the students and help them become more engaged. And the suggestion is, even if you don't feel that way on a particular day, fake it, because it does seem to work, and you'll start feeling more of that as you go through that.
The other thing too is like if you're just starting to feel bored by the way you're teaching something or the assignments, like I don't want to read another XYZ paper or whatever. Like these are moments or opportunities to leverage some of the strategies that we've offered today to like rekindle your own curiosity and your own interest in student work so that you can continue to kind of model it for students.
I know I switched to podcasts and book projects in a capstone course, and I introduced some podcast projects in an online introductory course. And it was so much more enjoyable listening to students' podcasts or reading chapters of books on topics they were excited about than the typical types of papers, term papers, or senior theses they used to write. And it makes it so much more fun when students are doing something that they enjoy. They do much higher quality work.
And they're much less likely to lean on AI for those sorts of things too.
Yes. Or if they do, it can be channeled in appropriate ways.
I think that's the end.
But where are their slides?
That's,
Where we had a resource document.
yeah, it's a separate link.
Oh, okay. And let's share that. I thought we had embedded that, no?
No.
We're going to share some resources, which I should have looked for before.
I'll grab the link and just put it into the thing.
Is it in the folder?
I'm gonna just put it as a comment on the first slide.
Okay.
There you go. So you can grab it.
Here we go. John starts. Okay. Oh, I was supposed to start. Okay. Oops. Let me put that in chat. So here's a link to some resources, and we can just take a quick look at that, I think. And if we do, let's see. Here we go. So we broke it down into each of the things we talked about, and we linked to some podcast episodes. We were asked for the keynote because people knew our podcast. So we connected it to some podcasts on curiosity and some that were interesting. We mentioned Josh Eiler. Jill Peter Fesso, though, did a nice discussion of role playing in her class. Professors at Play talk about playful activities that can be embedded in class, as do Victoria Mondelli and Joe Biz. Um, Agency and choice. Here's some discussion of UDL. Our friend Jessamine Newhouse, we used to do many reading groups with her before she moved off to Syracuse, where now she's the director of the teaching center there. She's still our friend, but we haven't done much collaborative work since then. A discussion of autonomy supportive teaching by Jed Lakio in our School of Ed. Here's a discussion of using infographics in an assignment. UDL in Action with Lillian Nave, who runs the Think UDL podcast. Some open pedagogy discussions. And this was a discussion of a project that I had the first time I had students create a book with three of the students in there who talked about their experience and how much they enjoyed creating materials that they could share with their parents and say, see, this is what you helped me pay for, or this is what I learned. And they also liked the fact that because it was publicly posted, they could link to it on the LinkedIn profiles and things. Talking about the importance of relevance. This was a fun episode. It was Why the Magic Matters. It's a course that Jill Peter Fesso taught where students traveled to Disney World, but she talked about how she brought in various disciplines and things. It was a fun episode that we probably couldn't afford to bring students there. She had a grant to help do it, but also other discussions about connecting to student values, designing for student learning, helping students recognize that what we're doing connects to their future jobs and so on. Guided note taking, someone we talked about earlier. Ken Bain's most recent book. Actually, it's one of the last, it may have been the last podcast he did. He died within the next 6 months or so. Um, Motivational syllabus, which again addresses many of those same things, the importance of relationships and so forth. Class Dismissed, by the way, is a really interesting one. Some of you may have seen Tony Jack when he was a speaker here. It was back in 2020, a week or two before we shut down for COVID, actually, with his earlier book. But Tony Jacks talks about facing the challenges of being an underrepresented minority, member of an underrepresented minority group or at Harvard as well as at a prep school, and some of the challenges that students who are first-gen students or from historically minoritized groups have faced when they are in a group who had very different experiences in terms of their educational background and so on. And a lot of stuff. This Tracy Addy in this episode, there's a link to the Who's in Class forum. And there's just a lot of discussion of ways in which we can help students get past the invisible, the hidden curriculum, and so on. And and in terms of mindset, David Yeager has a great book on that, which was one of our reading books a year and a half ago, I think it was, on mentor mindset to help address the issue of student motivation, and another podcast with Elizabeth Canning about growth mindset. And there's a lot. And here's a whole host of books that we found to be useful. And many of them, again, align with the podcast. But if you want to learn more about any of those things, those are some really good resources. So
Stop sharing the screen.
we can stop sharing. So any thoughts or comments or suggestions? Oh, and let me move the screen over there. Well, let me close that. And now I can move the screen over there.
Anything that anyone's interested in trying, but maybe not quite sure how to get started?
I think, it's like, I feel like anytime I go to something like this, I'm like, I get all these ideas like, oh yeah, that's exciting, all these different things. And, I know I can't implement them all at once. And,
That's right, you shouldn't.
right.
Yeah.
So thoughts or suggestions about like where to start or how to start? I mean, I feel like there's a lot of things that I do already, right? And
Yeah.
that I'm trying um, and, and that's sort of been my impetus. Like, I feel like the classes that have been the most successful are the ones that I've tried to make like most experimental and most fun. Like focusing on the idea of like fun I think has been kind of successful.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that playfulness really builds into that kind of curiosity piece. So that's important. I would say like look at the like categories, like the ingredient categories that we like shared and think about maybe like which one of those have you tried the least? And
mhm,
maybe that's a spot to like invest a little bit of time to see if maybe one of those strategies would be interesting to integrate. So, for example, if relevance was one that maybe you didn't do as much, then maybe like try a strategy in that particular category. It sounds like if you're doing things that are focused on fun and things like that, then maybe you got that curiosity category like
mhm,
dipped up, but maybe like pick a different one.
And Tom Tobin's suggestion of using a +1 strategy, in that if you do want to introduce things from a category, you don't have to do it over and over again every week. It could be just trying it once, seeing how it works, and then maybe adding that a bit, if it's working well, adding a bit more each time. Although you probably don't want to introduce something and then give up if it didn't work well the first time, because the first time we try something, it often won't work as well as we'd like. But the second time or the third time, it tends to get a bit better. Now, if you do something and after 4 or 5 years it's just failing, you may want to move on. But just try making some small changes to keep it manageable, because I know I have a tendency to try to change everything all at once, and that can be overwhelming and exhausting and lead to burnout and all those negative things. But
I mean, think about scaffolding for yourself too, right? A little bit of an iterative approach. Like, what's my first bite size, like introduction to an idea that I might want to try? And then, like, how might I scope that a little bit bigger next time and can build on something? But if you can kind of map out what maybe a couple semesters out might look like, and then think about what are some of the steps to kind of get there, that can be helpful, especially if you can kind of do it in a more low stakes way for yourself initially. The same
right.
strategies that work for students work for us too, right? So if you try like a low stakes implementation at first, just see how it goes, like can give you a sense of like where to go next without feeling like, it's disruptive to your class or what have you.
And ask for feedback from students. Let them know this is the first time you tried it, and ask them what they thought. What might make it work more effectively? What could be done differently? And they appreciate being asked, and they often become a bit more engaged in it
And
in those
forgiving.
cases, and forgiving if things didn't go as well. And they generally appreciate it though when their professors are trying new things. So
Yeah. Kind of that transparency around that item can be really valuable.
also humanizing the professor too.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. We appreciate your attention and hopefully the resources are helpful.
yeah, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
Nice to see you.
Good seeing
Bye.
you.
Bye.
I'll stop the recording.